Taking a look once again at that dramatic jailbreak footage with the retro-thinker accompanied by what appears to be the anti-thinker. Both men remain at large.
Commissioner Bunnyface, hello.
It's Buonafacio. What?
OverThinker, are you watching the news?
You have an armed guard watching my house, so I'm pretty sure you already know what I'm doing.
You're damn right. And I can also tell you're wearing your pajamas in the middle of the day.
You've had me locked up in here for like a month. What do you think I have? Infinitely renewing clothes?
I don't suppose there's anything you want to tell me about this.
No, none of this makes sense. The anti-thinker is dead. I watched him die. Twice.
So what then? Robot? Clone? Life model
Those are copyrighted.
I don't know. The anti-thinker was an interdimensional doppelganger, a parallel universe me. But from the antiverse. There's not a lot of literature about how any of that is supposed to work. And even if it is him, I have no idea what he'd be doing with the retro-thinker.
Other than them both being supervillains.
Retro-thinker is not a villain. We've been over this. He is not the necro-thinker. He turns into the necro-thinker, but it's a separate personality.
Kid, it looks bad for you right now. The guy you swear isn't evil just ran off with the guy we know is evil that you said was dead. Your credibility is damn near spent. And lest you forget, your credibility ain't just the only thing keeping you out of jail. It's the only thing keeping Pyrothinker and Cryothinker in.
Oh, they're two separate guys again? Good to know.
I don't know what to tell you, Commissioner.
You just keep your eyes on this thing, kid, because we've got eyes on you.
Well, this is quite the development.
I'll say.
So what do you really think? Is it him?
Anti-thinker? Sure looks like him, but I don't know why he'd still be in human form. As I remember, he was a lot stronger in his own skin.
Well, he handled those guns like a veteran. Just immediately knew how to use them once he picked them up.
Yeah, straight out of GTA.
Wait, I don't get it. You mean he's being satirical?
What?
You said he's like Grand Theft Auto, right?
I meant that he handled the gun with implausible foreknowledge like a character in Grand Theft Auto, but yes.
Well, isn't GTA a satire?
I don't really think so. Where did you hear that from?
On the internet.
Ugh, Ivan, we've been over this. The internet doesn't know what words mean. Example, the internet thinks satire is a magic word that makes games, movies, books, anything that might have any content that might be deemed offensive, magically immune from criticism.
So video games can't be satire?
I didn't say that. It's just that gamers tend to seize on its satire as a way of deflecting criticism without really comprehending the actual concept behind the word. And it's not helped that some developers have seized on it as well, doing exactly the same thing but in a quasi-official capacity, choosing to describe their games as satirical when they're not.
You mean like they're full of shit?
Not necessarily. Comedy is a varied medium, and there's a lot of humor that is adjacent to satire that is not necessarily satire in and of itself, or in and out of different contexts. The problem is the word satire has become everyone's favorite get-out-of-being-criticized free card when it comes to offensive, sexist, racist, whatever humor, and it's not necessarily always appropriate. Plus, the misuse of the term hurts our ability to properly discuss and indeed grow the narrative and the medium.
Heh, this would make a good topic for—
Just roll the credits, Ivan. You know, Ivan, we hear a lot today about trying to make video games work as a medium for serious, meaningful narrative drama.
Why are we doing a setup? We already had a setup. Are you just fucking with people who skip to the credits?
You know, Ivan, we hear a lot today about trying to make video games work as a medium for serious, meaningful drama. And how often it simply doesn't work as such, since we still haven't found a way to make serious drama square with that pretentious bullshit word that we don't use around here.
Oh, you mean ludonarrative dissonance?
Really?
But yeah, basically that. Thing is, the more agency you give a player, the more they're gonna play, and most of the time that can't help but undermine the drama. I mean, yeah, take Grand Theft Auto franchise. Even though a lot of their worlds are built for laughs, they do try to get you invested in the characters on some kind of meaningful level. All the better to make you want to play all the way through the game and not just fuck around with the landscape. GTA 5 is funny, or at least it's trying to be funny, but we're clearly supposed to ultimately care about, or at least empathize with, Michael, Franklin, and Trevor.
Okay, probably not Trevor, but Michael and Franklin definitely.
Problem is, the game can only really control that dramatic narrative, even if just barely, during the missions, heist, and other predetermined story sequences. In between that, well, it's still Grand Theft Auto, so you've likely been getting up to all kinds of mischief in between that. And I mean even if you're not trying, given how cluttered and touchy the mandatory versus optional mission structure is. And it can't help but undermine whatever narrative is trying to do with these characters if you've been, say, using Franklin to serial murder hookers, or Michael to jump cars onto roofs in the downtime. It's just kind of the way things are right now. The only alternative we seem to have found is to place massive restrictions on player agency, like David Cage does in his movie games. The problem there being, look, I don't have a lot of time here, go play one of David Cage's games and maybe just check a Let's Play and you'll see what the problem is pretty quickly. But you know, drama is not the only kind of narrative, and I can think of at least one alternative that video games aren't just good at now, but that they've always been good at.
Pornography.
Comedy.
You see, games are kind of silly by nature, so they lend themselves really well to absurdity and thus to comedy. Video games may be blundering and stumbling on their way towards some kind of workable dramatic framework over the last generation or two, but the medium has been good at being funny since the days when it was only text. I mean, think about how many stone-cold classics of the medium are at their core comedy games. Monkey Island, Maniac Mansion, Earthbound, the various Mario RPGs, Earthworm Jim, Boogerman, No More Heroes, Conquer, Grim Fandango, Space Quest. Video games, as it turns out, are a really good foundation for making us laugh.
So all those games are satire?
No. Well, some of them, yes, but not all comedy is satire. There's a lot of different versions of comedy.
So why do people claim so many games are satire?
Well, that's complicated. You need to understand the different types of comedy that are often associated with satire or can become satire themselves in the right context.
Such as?
Well, for starters,
Parody basically means comedy making fun of something specific, usually something that isn't itself funny or meant to be funny to begin with.
Example?
Well, you know Weird Al Yankovic?
Of course.
Well, most of Weird Al's songs are parodies of real popular songs. He's making fun of those songs, and the fact that we recognize the not funny original song is part of the joke.
Okay, I get it. So parody is different from satire.
yes, except when parody is satire.
What?
Satire is basically parody but with a message. Also, many times it starts from the premise of finding something that's funny about a serious thing rather than adding funny to it, but the message is still the most important distinction. Satire uses comedy not just to mock something but to make a statement about it, even if that statement is little more than this thing can be mocked. And since parody is one way of making something look ridiculous or funny, it can be a tool of satire.
Example?
Well, here's a good distinction. Spaceballs is a parody of Star Wars. It's taking Star Wars and adding a bunch of funny stuff to it or redoing it in a funny way in order to mine it for comedy. Wouldn't it be funny if instead of just acting kind of like Han's dog, Chewbacca was a dog? Wouldn't it be funny if Darth Vader was actually just a dweeby short guy underneath all the armor? All silly just for the sake of being silly. But that one part where Yogurt is going on about merchandising, that is satire, because it's not just goofing on the Star Wars movies, it's making a point about the way commercialism was changing the movie business in the post-Star Wars era.
So, satire has a message. Okay.
And sometimes, if the target is important or serious enough, the mere act of parody can be a message in and of itself. Say I take some random nobody and put a clown nose on him. That's parody, because it's just some guy and I made him look silly. But if I put a clown nose on, say, a politician, now it's satire.
So why is satire a go-to defense word instead of parody?
Good question. Basically, it's because satire can often be very, very dark. Did you ever see Natural Born Killers?
Okay, there's a flashback scene in that movie that basically is supposed to explain how the character Mallory became a killer, namely by showing how she had a terrible childhood and was abused by her asshole father. In the movie, the scene is staged in the style of an American TV sitcom, with famous comedian Rodney Dangerfield playing the dad and a laugh track playing during the abuse scenes. This is meant to satirize the way sitcoms like this trivialize the complexities of real family problems, taking it to the ultimate extreme.
The way you talk in front of your mother? You old stupid bitch. You watch your language. Or I'll kick the shit out of you, like I do her. So if your ass is in this house, it's my ass.
I get it. So what's the problem?
Well, because satire often involves shocking people to get your point across, and because shocking people is easy, at some point a lot of lesser writers, comedians, etc. decided that satire was also easy. Just shock people. In addition, toward the end of the 1980s there was a backlash against so-called shock comedians, and some practitioners of the form opted to try and salvage their material by claiming that their more questionable stuff, like racist caricatures, sexist humor, rape jokes, etc., were okay because they were actually engaging in satire.
So were they being shameless, or were they just dumb enough that they actually thought they were doing satire?
You see, the were they just dumb part kinda makes this impossible to track.
And either way, it didn't matter. It worked. Where actually satirizing racism, sexism, whatever became the easiest way for divisive or offensive material to deflect criticism, whether it was valid or not, because the internet loves nothing more than a way to justify going to the mat for stuff they've already made up their minds about that sounds unassailably smart, but also almost invariably is not. See also men's rights activism, anarcho-capitalism, and bitcoins.
So, what do you think? Is Grand Theft Auto 5 a satire?
Well, it's definitely a parody. Everything about it, from the design of Los Santos to the TV shows to the voices on the car radios, is about making fun of Los Angeles as a city and a culture. It's not a particularly fresh parody, though. There are pretty much the same jokes at the expense of how crummy LA is supposed to be that comedians have been making since the 70s, but it's demonstrably a parody nonetheless.
But you're not sure it's satire because...
Because satire is parody with a point, and I'm not really sure GTA 5 has one beyond LA sucks. And that doesn't really count because it doesn't have a thesis for why it thinks LA sucks. I mean, the Impotent Rage cartoons are clearly a satirical separate thing within the game, but otherwise, no, I don't buy the whole holding up a dark mirror idea. Just running around gathering up examples of things that are shitty in the world and dumping them into a game doesn't automatically make it satire.
Please understand, I am not saying that GTA 5 is bad or that it's not fun, intermittently. Lots of elements of it are parody, certainly, but satire, I'm not feeling it.
Even if the people making the game say they meant it as satire?
If I call myself Tom Brady, does that make me Tom Brady? And even if I set out to become Tom Brady, does that necessarily mean I'm going to succeed?
No. Okay, so parody is making fun of something, and satire is parody with a point. Those can't be the only two options.
Oh no, there's tons of different kinds of humor that have worked in games and still work in games. It's just that none of them are as popular as get-out-of-jail-free cards. For example...
Technically, irony is supposed to refer to the use of a word or phrase to express the opposite meaning of its literal intent, usually for humorous effect. For example, if something bad happens and I say, "Oh, great," that's irony. Or when your friend pulls an epic fail and you go, "Nice," irony. Thusly, as you may have surmised, irony is most commonly utilized as the basis of sarcasm. But late 20th century Western pop culture saw the rise of a different permutation, ironic appreciation, or what we used to call guilty pleasures or slumming, the indulging of this or that activity on the basis that you know it's bad or beneath you and enjoying the high that comes from that sense of superiority.
Oh, you mean like watching terrible movies for fun?
Or going to a dive bar when you can afford to go to a nicer bar.
Or actually going to eat at Guy Fieri's restaurant?
The issue with irony as an overused dodge arose when so-called appreciation reached fever pitch around the turn of the century, with Generation X indulging in gratuitous nostalgia and using "I'm being ironic" as a kind of cover. Irony became a way for a generation that had learned to mock and deride all semblance of earnest emotional attachment to re-embrace a sense of whimsy without betraying their supposed ideals. By contrast, the so-called millennial generation seems more than happy to like what they like unapologetically without having to pretend like they're doing some kind of sarcastic performance art. In gaming, the irony dodge often comes in the form of ironic sexism and racism, i.e. games that prop up sexist or racist humor with the excuse of actually being an ironic condemnation of the same. The problem being that irony relies on a general agreement between the artist and the audience that the thing being presented is both bad and outside the norm enough to be shocking, something that isn't at all clear in modern gaming culture.
Also, if we're being honest, doing ironic offensive humor takes a level of writing skill that most games just do not possess. Sorry.
It's also important not to confuse ironic offense with straight-up condemnation. For example, BioShock Infinite is chock full of racist imagery, but it's not being ironic about it. The message is that these people are bad, their views are proof of it, and that's why it's okay to throw flaming crows at them, destroy their civilization, and stab their police force in the face with a chainsaw. It's not being ironic, it's being incendiary.
So, why don't more games use irony?
Well, tone can be very hard in games because you have player input as an unknown variable all the time. And irony is almost totally dependent on establishing a reliable tone that you can then subvert. Like, Duke Nukem is supposed to be ironic in the way that it hero worships dumb, macho 80s action stereotypes. But so many games and movies do that same basic macho asshole thing without a hint of irony, it doesn't really hold up.
Fair enough, please continue.
Now, this is where a lot of the games that often claim to be or are misidentified as being satirical actually belong. Remember, satire requires an actual message, and parody requires a specific target. Absurdism, on the other hand, is pretty much just weird for the sake of weird, blowing things up to their logical extreme and deriving humor from, well, absurdity. Good examples of absurdity in gaming would probably be intentionally over-the-top or gonzo material like Fantasy Zone or Applejack or the whatever-man goofiness of Battletoads, but the ultimate modern AAA king of absurdity is Suda51. There's really not much message or meaning behind the insanity of No More Heroes or Killer 7, they're just collection of weird things that happen to wind him up. This one can be tricky though, because you do sometimes see message and meaning in otherwise absurdist pieces, but this doesn't necessarily transform them from absurdity to satire. For example, the cartoonishly absurd Metal Gear games all have a message amid all their nonsense, but there's no joke involved. By all accounts, Kojima really is totally serious regarding what his games have to say about politics, terrorism, and the corporatization of the military. It's just nested in absurdity to presumably make the medicine go down.
Or, he could just be insane.
Or both. Any more?
Oh, tons, but those 4 give you kind of the big subcategories, and then everything else is subcategories of subcategories.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. Young Frankenstein is a parody.
Yes, of Universal monster movies.
But Blazing Saddles, satire?
Yes.
Because it's using explicit contemporary racial humor to say something when juxtaposed with the more implicit racism of the Western genre?
Bingo.
So, The Simpsons?
A parody of the American sitcom family, but also sometimes just a straight sitcom in and of its own right.
Aqua Teen Hunger Force?
Absurdism.
The Colbert Report?
Satire.
South Park?
Really tiresome, self-righteous satire.
But Grand Theft Auto 5?
I just don't see what it's supposed to be satirizing.
I mean, GTA 5 honestly would have been a better case at being satire, because the overriding theme is contrasting the classically optimistic American immigrant story with the vastly different experience waiting for Nico. And yeah, I get that Trevor can be construed as a swipe by the developers at some of their more alarmingly devoted fans, but okay, unless you've got something to say about him, or about Los Santos, or about anything else in the game other than pointing and laughing, it's not satire.
Uh-huh. So what would you call Saints Row 4 then?
A better game.
Besides that?
A much better game.
Besides that?
Honestly, while I'd say that GTA 5 is ultimately just a parody, though not that there's anything wrong with that, Saints Row 4 actually comes closer to being genuine satire.
Really? What is it satirizing?
The entire last generation of gaming, and in particular the rise and subsequent bloating and self-seriousness of the sandbox genre.
I mean, it's a game where your main objective is to break the so-called reality of a virtual simulation, the realism of a game. That, plus the way it deliberately treats the Saints, who we know are little more than an army of amoral psychopathic gangland assholes, with the same totally sincere mythic grandiosity as the legendary heroes of other contemporary action games, basically amounts to a pantsing of the entire last decade or so of the medium. It's a game about gaming kinda having its head up its ass for the last few—
Sir, I think that last part might actually be better as an Overbites episode.
Hey, there's an idea. So stay tuned for that one, kids.
So, in summary, Grand Theft Auto 5 is...
not a satire as far as I'm concerned, and also that video games should embrace comedy and humor more often, but stop leaning on the usually non-existent pretense of this one strain of comedy as an unnecessary justification for stuff that's basically just dumb fun, Grand Theft Auto is just fine as a big, dumb, cathartic, grown-up playground for venting all your frustrations, all over an urban crime landscape borrowed from TV shows and old movies, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just enjoy it instead of trying to rebrand it as satire. Commissioner Bunny?
Save it, kid. I don't have much time. They're coming for me. I'm sorry. I was wrong. It's all gone wrong. You need to get...
My fellow Americans, please do not be alarmed by this unfortunate but necessary interruption of your regularly scheduled television broadcast.
Are those?
What the shit?
My name is Senator Joseph Lieberson, and I come before you tonight to talk about threats to our national security and to your very lives. I speak of the threat of video games.
Oh, crap.
And also of a far greater threat, the threat of the game OverThinker.